The night of November 28, 1953. New York City, the Statler Hotel. The night porter hears more than just the sound of shattering glass. He hears a dull thud, followed by a shower of shards falling onto the sidewalk. A man's body is plummeting from the 13th floor. This isn't just any man. It's Frank Olson, a brilliant bacteriologist from a secret CIA division. The official story: suicide brought on by depression. But what could drive a completely loyal intelligence officer, privy to state secrets, to take such a step? The answer turns a tragedy into a conspiracy. 9 days before his death, CIA colleagues under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb secretly dosed Olson with LSD. His fall was no accident, but a direct consequence of an uncontrolled experiment on the human mind. In 20 minutes, we'll reveal how Olson's family fought for decades to uncover the truth, and how their struggles set off a chain reaction that led to the biggest expose in CIA history. Olson's death uncovers two fundamental paradoxes. The first, brainwashing, psychological pressure, and interrogation drugs were all associated with the USSR, China, and North Korea. How could it be that at the very same time, the very same arsenal was being developed and deployed within the CIA, the leading intelligence agency of the democratic world? The second paradox: the methods were unpredictable and dangerous, even to their own people. Why wasn't the program shut down after the very first casualties among its own staff? What compelled the CIA to continue spending millions on experiments that were literally devouring them from the inside? These two questions, two cracks in the facade of American democracy, will be the main guides for our investigation. We will begin to find the answers in Section 5, when we analyze the role of the scientists, and will fully resolve them in Section 8, when we reach the findings of the Church Committee. This is not just a historical documentary. This is a manual for the most dangerous weapon of all, one that targets not the body, but the mind. We will dismantle this arsenal piece by piece. You will learn how sensory deprivation works, why LSD was considered the key to the soul, and how the CIA's official manual on psychological torture was written. This knowledge will allow you to recognize manipulation, not just in spy thrillers, but in real life. Psychological abuse is more terrifying than physical abuse. It doesn't work like a hammer blow, but like soil erosion. First, subtle currents of doubt and fear wash away self-confidence. Then, once the foundation is gone, the entire structure of the personality collapses in an instant. Have you ever felt like you were losing control of your own thoughts under pressure? Here is the roadmap for our investigation. In 8 minutes, we will be inside a sensory deprivation chamber. You won't just hear about it. You will understand the mechanics of why total silence and darkness can drive a person mad faster than the most powerful drugs. In 14 minutes, a declassified document, codenamed KUBARK, will be laid out before you. This is the official CIA manual that turned chaotic experiments into a science of psychological destruction. And in 20 minutes, we will return to the story of Frank Olson and see how the death of one man led to the most explosive political scandal in CIA history. This expose was so massive that the final Senate report filled 15 printed volumes. Our journey will begin with a project whose name sounds harmless, but whose methods laid the foundation for all the madness that followed. The dawn of the Cold War. How did a victorious nation, just a few years after the war, become gripped by an irrational fear of an invisible weapon? Brainwashing? The answer seemed to be chemical. Project Artichoke was the CIA's first attempt to find a truth serum, a substance that could force people to talk against their will. But the initial experiments with alcohol, marijuana, and hypnosis were failures. Instead of the truth, agents got incoherent rambling and fabricated stories. During the Korean War, roughly 1 in 3 American POWs collaborated with the enemy, a statistic that sparked panic. The failure of Artichoke didn't stop the CIA. It only proved that to control the mind, a completely different scale was needed. Who became the first expendable subjects in this hunt? The logic was simple: the enemy. The CIA began using drugs on suspected Soviet spies and double agents. It seemed like a harsh but justified measure. However, the interrogation logs reveal the truth. The intelligence gathered was completely useless. Under the influence of these substances, people would confess to anything, mixing reality with fantasy. Trying to extract truth with drugs was like trying to draw clear water from a muddy spring. The more you shake the spring, the more dirt rises from the bottom. Knowing the method didn't work, the CIA concluded that the problem wasn't the method, but that human will was still too strong. This pursuit of the perfect substance, one capable of breaking the will, led them to a discovery that would change everything. How were brutal experiments on human beings possible in a country with a constitution and laws? The universal justification was national security at any cost. But this wasn't just an atmosphere of fear. It was the deliberate policy of one man, CIA Director Allen Dulles. He was convinced that you had to fight the enemy with their own weapons, even if those weapons were inhumane. Dulles became the architect of a moral gray zone where laws no longer applied. It was he, a lawyer by training, who in 1973 personally ordered the destruction of most records on the experiments to cover their tracks. He didn't just authorize it, he initiated the birth of a monster that would soon get its own name and an unlimited budget. What could be more insane than secret experiments that had already proven ineffective? After a series of failures, the project could have been quietly shelved. Artichoke was just a warm-up, a crude test of the tools. But the CIA's logic worked differently. If Artichoke was an attempt to pick the lock of the human mind, the next program aimed to tear down the entire wall, to completely erase a personality and build a new, controllable one in its place. This program received a name that was classified for decades and is now a synonym for inhuman experiments and the absolute abuse of power: MKUltra. We are now entering the heart of darkness. On April 13, 1953, just 1 month after Stalin's death, the CIA launched MKUltra. At first glance, it seems like a logical continuation. The fear of Soviet brainwashing demanded a countermeasure, a way to understand how their weapon worked. But declassified project goals show this was not about defense, but offense. The objectives included creating amnesia, implanting false memories, inducing addiction, and developing methods for covert assassinations. This was a shift from trying to extract truth to creating a new reality in a person's head, one useful to the CIA. And for this monstrous mission, a specific person was chosen: Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist his colleagues privately called the Black Sorcerer. He needed a proving ground for his ideas, and he found it where no one was looking. Where did Gottlieb get people for his secret experiments? The first thought is obvious: prisoners, patients in psychiatric hospitals, those who couldn't fight back. This seemed like a cruel but limited practice, targeting marginalized individuals. However, the Church Committee report shatters this illusion. More than 80 institutions across the country were secretly involved in the program. 44 prestigious universities, 12 hospitals, and 15 research foundations. This was not a series of isolated experiments, but a sprawling, nationwide network. The most terrifying conclusion: experiments were conducted on unsuspecting students, patients, and ordinary citizens. The line between protecting the nation and waging war against its own people had been completely erased, and the main weapon in this war was a single chemical substance. That weapon was LSD. Gottlieb's logic seemed flawless. To take a deep, controlled breath in, that is, to imprint a new personality, one must first completely exhale, erasing the old one. LSD, which induces depersonalization and dissolves the boundaries of the ego, was a way to forcibly knock the wind out of someone. But theory shattered against reality. The first experiments were completely uncontrollable. CIA agents, including Gottlieb himself, secretly dosed each other with LSD during meetings, provoking panic and psychotic episodes that lasted for days. This madness wasn't an exception. It was the system. It was within this corrupt practice that Frank Olson received his dose. He was not a random victim, but an inevitable one. But LSD was not their only method. What if a person could be broken without being touched or given any drugs? LSD was just the most famous tool in the MKUltra arsenal. The program sought out any vulnerability of the psyche. Soon, CIA scientists turned to a method that required no injections or pills. It used what everyone has: silence and darkness. Emptiness became a weapon. We will show how the CIA built an architecture of torture, where emptiness itself was the primary building material. In the next section, you will learn why the scientists testing this weapon of emptiness became its first victims. The paradox is how the complete absence of everything, sounds, light, touch, can induce vivid hallucinations and break the psyche faster than many drugs. The human brain is not built for a void. Deprived of signals from the senses, it goes into an emergency mode and begins to invent reality, chaotically activating the parts of the brain responsible for dreams. The theory was a pale copy of the practice. CIA scientists who tested the sensory deprivation chambers themselves reported severe panic attacks and visual hallucinations after just 2 to 3 hours. But instead of being frightened, the CIA saw this as the perfect tool for wiping the slate of consciousness clean. To test their other tool, LSD, in field conditions, they created one of the most cynical projects in their history. How do you study the effects of LSD on ordinary people if the experiment itself must remain secret? The CIA created so-called safe houses, clandestine apartments for conducting experiments. But the truth was far dirtier. Under Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA set up brothels in New York and San Francisco. Prostitutes were paid to bring clients, whose drinks were then spiked with LSD without their knowledge. This wasn't science. It was a despicable trap. Behind a one-way mirror in a brothel on Telegraph Hill sat Agent George Hunter White. Sipping a martini, he would coolly take notes in his journal on the stages of psychosis, terror, and panic in his unsuspecting subjects. In his diaries, he called this studying people in real-life situations. But LSD and deprivation were just 2 of dozens of approaches. Besides these, MKUltra attempted to implement other ideas. A total of 149 separate sub-projects were launched. They studied hypnosis, acoustic, and electromagnetic weapons, and developed untraceable poisons and drugs to induce amnesia. This created the impression of an all-powerful, terrifyingly effective program. However, the reports show that not a single one of these methods produced a stable, controllable result. Attempts to create a Manchurian candidate, a programmable assassin, failed. MKUltra was a massive, expensive, and completely unethical scientific failure. This brings us to a question. If the methods were created by chemists and physicists, who gave this madness the veneer of science? The answer leads us to the men in white coats. Behind every experiment stood not only agents, but also respected professors, psychologists, and doctors from leading universities and clinics. They were working for the good of the nation, receiving generous government grants. But their work directly violated the Hippocratic Oath. The principle of do no harm was consciously sacrificed for national security. This was not a mistake, but a deliberate betrayal of their profession. These scientists served as a kind of sieve for the CIA. They sifted through the brutal experiments, filtering out the immoral details and leaving only a pure, scientific extract that could be used to justify the program. The next section will reveal how the CIA turned the country's best universities into its secret laboratories. Why did psychologists, whose profession is to heal mental trauma, agree en masse to develop methods for inflicting them? The CIA used 3 levers. First, generous grants through front foundations. Second, access to classified data. Third, appeals to patriotic duty at the height of the Cold War. But the system was more cunning. Many studies were disguised as legitimate scientific projects on stress or memory. The scientists might not have known the ultimate goal of their work. The CIA commissioned individual bricks from them, which it later used to build its weapons. However, key figures, like psychologist Donald Hebb of McGill University, whose work formed the basis of sensory deprivation torture, were fully aware of the military potential of their discoveries. Their collaboration was conscious. Did none of the hundreds of scientists involved ever try to protest? There are documented cases of individual researchers expressing ethical concerns. But they were few and far between. The system of suppression worked like a firebreak in a forest. The structure of MKUltra was compartmentalized into cells. Scientists were unaware of each other's work. This isolated pockets of doubt, preventing them from merging into a wildfire of organized protest. Any dissenter could be instantly removed, defunded, and labeled unpatriotic. The result was a systemic failure. The overwhelming majority chose conformity and career advancement. It was this silent consent of the intellectual elite that became the program's foundation. And this elite was concentrated in the nation's most prestigious universities. How did the CIA manage to conduct experiments in public universities while maintaining secrecy? They created a network of front organizations, such as the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. These foundations awarded grants for what appeared to be ordinary psychological research. It looked like standard scientific activity. But through these foundations, the CIA directly funded projects at Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. University campuses became proving grounds for MKUltra. This gave criminal experiments an aura of academic respectability. Donald Hebb alone was granted over $60,000 through a front foundation, equivalent to $500,000 today. As a result, science as an institution was weaponized, and every weapon needs an instruction manual. How could a collection of chaotic, often failed experiments be turned into a clear manual for action? By the early 1960s, the CIA had amassed a vast amount of data. A need arose to consolidate this experience to pass it on to new generations of interrogators. They needed a textbook. Thus, a document was born that became the quintessence of all MKUltra's knowledge on psychological breakdown. It took the most effective findings and turned them into a step-by-step methodology. This was the birth of an official doctrine of torture. Its name, KUBARK. In the next section, we will open this manual and see exactly which techniques the CIA recommended to break a person without ever laying a hand on them. In 1963, this chaos was codified. The CIA issued a 128-page document that transformed failed experiments into a systematic, scientifically backed doctrine. On paper, it looked like progress, a shift from medieval torture to subtle psychological manipulation. But the reality hidden within its chapters was a punch to the gut. It was the quintessence of MKUltra's most brutal discoveries, step-by-step instructions on using isolation, sensory deprivation, and sleep disruption to create a feeling of complete hopelessness in a subject. KUBARK legalized psychological abuse. It turned the immoral experiments of a handful of scientists into standard operating procedure for thousands of agents. That is why its key techniques were aimed not at the body, but at destroying a person's fundamental sense of reality. What specific techniques of psychological assault were described in such detail? At first glance, they seem almost harmless, manipulating light, temperature, and time. But their real goal was much deeper: to force an adult mind to regress to an infantile, completely dependent state. By taking away a person's control over basic needs, sleep, food, time, the interrogator assumes the role of an all-powerful parental figure. The adult personality is shattered. The process is like slowly lowering the temperature of water. First, the person feels discomfort. Then, their movements are restricted by the cold. And finally, they freeze in a state of complete helplessness. KUBARK was not an interrogation manual, but a guide to the temporary erasure of personality. It even advised agents to study child psychology to better understand the mechanisms of dependency. And this doctrine was simply waiting for its moment to be reborn in a new, even more cynical form. In 1975, the Church Committee exposes MKUltra. President Gerald Ford signs an executive order banning human experimentation. It seemed that the history of inhumane methods was over. The CIA publicly disavowed the approaches described in KUBARK. It looked like the repentance of a system that had brought itself within the bounds of the law. But while the right words were being spoken in public, something else was happening in the quiet of the archives. You can ban a practice, but you can't ban knowledge. The KUBARK manual and its derivatives were not destroyed. They were left in training centers as historical artifacts. The dangerous knowledge didn't disappear. It was preserved. It was like putting a virus in a test tube and placing it on a lab shelf. That test tube was just waiting for a moment when fear in society would become so strong that someone would decide to open it again. What event could make a nation that condemned torture willingly return to it? It would have to be something that struck at the very sense of security of every citizen. The illusion of invulnerability that America lived in after the Cold War collapsed in an instant. The morning of September 11th, 2001. That shock became a moral blank check for the intelligence agencies. Fear proved stronger than ethical considerations. The prohibitions of the 1970s began to seem naive and outdated. Just 6 days later, on September 17th, President Bush signed a secret memorandum giving the CIA unprecedented powers. KUBARK was no longer just a historical document. It was once again a relevant guide to action. In the next section, we will see how the ghosts of MKUltra returned in the 21st century under the name Enhanced Interrogation Techniques. How did methods condemned as torture in the 70s return under the scientific-sounding name Enhanced Interrogation Techniques? Officially, they were presented as harsh but non-injurious measures: sleep deprivation, stress positions, waterboarding. The key argument for the lawyers: they leave almost no physical marks. But the picture changes dramatically when we place two documents side by side, KUBARK and the description of these techniques. The goal of the new methods, learned helplessness, is a verbatim repetition of KUBARK's goal, infantile regression. Two psychologists, James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, having studied old CIA programs, simply repackaged them into a new product and sold it to the government. Their firm received over $80 million, but to use these methods, they had to do the unthinkable: change the very definition of torture. How could lawyers in a democratic state legalize the illegal? They argued that the ban on cruel punishment applied to convicted criminals, not enemy combatants. But the devil was in the definitions. The secret torture memos stipulated that pain is only considered torture if its intensity is comparable to organ failure or death. By this logic, anything that doesn't kill or permanently maim is not torture. Psychological suffering and the destruction of personality were completely left out of the equation. It's like taking a ruler and simply redrawing the inch marks to be twice as long. The objects don't change their size, but according to your new legal ruler, they become shorter. Legal permission was granted. But did it have any practical purpose at all? Let's set aside ethics and law. Did it even work? For years, the CIA claimed the program saved thousands of lives by breaking the resistance of terrorists. It was a bitter but necessary pill. But when the U.S. Senate conducted its own investigation, the picture was the exact opposite. After examining millions of internal documents, the committee concluded that enhanced interrogation techniques were ineffective. In its 6,700-page report, it proved that under torture, people provided false information to make the suffering stop, and that any valuable intelligence, if obtained at all, was acquired before the techniques were applied. This brings us back to the main paradox. If the methods don't work for obtaining truth, why continue them? Perhaps the real goal was not to obtain information, but to demonstrate absolute power. But that power always comes at a human cost. We've talked about programs, manuals, and techniques, but what lies behind these impersonal terms? The most prominent story of exposure began with the death of one scientist, Frank Olson. For decades, his fall from a hotel window was seen as an isolated, though tragic, incident. But Olson's death was not in vain. It was the persistence of his family, who for 22 years refused to believe the official story, that became the catalyst that caught the attention of Senator Frank Church. His investigation became the most extensive in CIA history. The tragedy of one man set in motion a process that brought the entire system of lies crashing down. And now, the story of how one family's clash with the machinery of the state led to a historic expose, and the price that all participants in this drama had to pay. How does a family that lived with the official story of suicide for 22 years discover they've been lied to the entire time? For decades, the CIA maintained its version. Agency representatives met with Olson's widow, expressed their condolences, and spoke of his depression. Then, in 1975, one of the church committee's reports was leaked to journalists. In the course of investigating other abuses, documents about the death of an unnamed scientist accidentally surfaced. The system never admits guilt voluntarily. Frank's son, Eric Olson, was sitting at his kitchen table when a headline in the Washington Post caught his eye. As he read the rustling pages of the newspaper, he realized the unnamed scientist who was secretly given LSD was his father. How can you investigate a program when nearly all of its documents have been destroyed? CIA Director Alan Dulles, anticipating scrutiny, had ordered all MKUltra archives to be burned back in 1973. Thousands of pages of reports were turned to ash. The crime seemed to be perfectly concealed, but Dulles overlooked one detail. The order didn't apply to the finance department. Senator Frank Church and his team began their investigation with nothing more than dull accounting records. Following this single thread, they unraveled the entire conspiracy. Through checks and receipts, investigators tracked which universities and hospitals the CIA had transferred money to. This is how the shocking fact was uncovered. More than 80 institutions had secretly participated in the program. The puzzle was assembled, and when the committee presented it to America, the nation was shaken. What happens when the most closely guarded secrets become public knowledge? The Church Committee's public hearings were televised. The country learned about the existence of MKUltra, about experiments on its own citizens, about illegal surveillance, and about plots to assassinate foreign leaders. But the real impact was not in the facts themselves, but in what they destroyed. Americans, who believed they lived in the freest country on earth, saw the dark side of their government for the first time. It was a profound crisis of trust, comparable to Watergate. As a result of the committee's work, new laws were passed and congressional oversight committees were created. It was the first leash ever put on the intelligence agencies. But as we now know, any barrier can be bypassed when great fear returns. We have followed the entire path, from Project Artichoke through the nightmare of MKUltra and its codification in KUBARK, to its revival after 9/11. What is the main lesson? We saw how fear breeds cruelty and secrecy breeds impunity. But this brings us back to the central paradox. Why does the state persistently use methods that are proven not to work for obtaining truth? What is their real purpose? Trying to get information with these methods is like trying to teach someone to speak by holding their mouth shut. The true goal is not to hear an answer, but to silence them forever. It is a tool not of intelligence gathering, but of absolute control. In the final section, we will bring all the elements together to prove this thesis and invite you to draw your own ultimate conclusion from this story. It all began with Project Artichoke, an attempt to find a chemical key to the lock of the mind. But the brain turned out not to be a lock. Attempts to crack it with hypnosis and drugs only produced chaos. This failure led the CIA to a conclusion that changed everything. If the lock can't be picked, then the entire wall must be torn down. Thus, MKUltra was born. Its goal was not to find a key, but to completely erase a personality. To reduce a person to a blank slate on which a new code could be written. Sensory deprivation, LSD, psychological abuse. All of these were tools not for interrogation, but for demolition. But for this demolition to become systematic, it needed a manual. That manual was KUBARK. It took the brutal findings of MKUltra and transformed them into a scientific-sounding, step-by-step methodology. It was this codification that allowed the knowledge to survive. After the scandals of the 1970s, the practices were banned, but not the document itself. It remained in the archives like a sleeper agent, a viral repository waiting for its moment. That's why, after 9/11, nothing had to be invented from scratch. The psychologists, Mitchell and Jessen, simply opened this archive. They took the key principles of KUBARK, infantile regression, and learned helplessness, and repackaged them into a new product. The knowledge of how to destroy a person didn't disappear. It just changed its name. This is the answer to the main question. Why use methods for decades that, as their own reports prove, do not yield truthful information? Because the goal was never information. The true goal is absolute control. These techniques flawlessly solve a different problem. They are guaranteed to break anyone's will. It is a demonstration of ultimate power, a message that says, we cannot just kill you, we can erase who you are. From this perspective, everything becomes logical. It is not a failure to obtain data, but a resounding success in achieving total submission. Now, knowing this, what frightens you more? A government that seeks the truth at any cost? Or a government that has no need for the truth at all? We have traced how a democracy, in its pursuit of security, created the perfect weapon. A weapon that breaks no bones and leaves no bruises, but shatters the very architecture of the self. At the end of this journey, we want you to answer one question that lies at its core. What, in your opinion, is more terrifying? Physical torture, which maims the body but can leave the self intact, or psychological torture, which preserves the body but erases the self? Write just one word in the comments. Body or mind? Your answer is not just a comment. It is your voice in the debate over the lines a society must never cross. Thank you for watching.